I'm coming from an initial background of industrial design, but industrial design in an art academy, and took a weird, windy road towards software and programming for performance. Ended up in Italy, ended up in various places, and was part of the Arduino development team, and all of the stuff that you do. And then I ended up working for 15 years at Stein. And my job at Stein was to facilitate and help and support and sometimes build other people's instruments. So that was an incredibly amazing thing to be allowed to do. But it also put this notion of what is an instrument? When do we know that we have something here? And what kind of risks are we possibly taking around the development of instruments? And also, who cares? And this is a really important thing that we kept coming back to at Stein, which is people would constantly come to us and say, I have thought of an instrument for somebody else to play. And we would never let them in because one person has to care. And it's possible that that person is you. But it has to be one person. So one of the rules that we put in as a limiting factor is that an instrument must come with a musician, with a musicianship, with a practice. Because, I mean, it doesn't have to in other contexts, but in the context where we're working, where resources are scarce, time is scarce, attention is scarce, it is important that we anchor all of these fantasies that we do into a lived experience of somebody who's taking an actual risk and living an actual life with us. And it echoes all the way down to traditional design. Traditionally, the designer would be sitting on a mountaintop, metaphorically, designing things for the people. You people should have a beautiful chair, and then you will be better. This idea of the designer as the sort of knowing better. We have an entire department where I'm working now called Systemic Change that is literally doing that. Why are you not a better person? Oh, I know, let me design an interface for you. And one of the things that we're trying to do where I am at is that we're trying to not do that. We're trying to bring ourselves into the equation and trying to not be the people who walk around and make things for other people without having put our own skin on the line. So, I am now working at the Technical University of Eindhoven. We are a technical university. We have a department for the design of nuclear power stations in a country that doesn't have nuclear power stations. Confusing. It's a huge university. It's very, very technical. It's regional in Holland. It means that we have an incredibly diverse and varied studentship. We have a bunch of bachelor students, we have a bunch of master students, we have a bunch of PhDs. One of the things that we do that I think I'm in part bringing to it is that we're trying to, at least in part and where we can, cross-teach across all levels of studentship. So I'm going to talk a little bit about student work here and there, and I'm going to try and remember to say who's bachelor student, who isn't. Because I think I'm coming back into academia from a point of view of feeling very strongly that I don't particularly know anything more than anybody else. My lived experience isn't more valuable than anybody else. I've just been around the block a few times. So there's a couple of things that I recognize. You start to be able to see what a bar fight looks like in the early stages at some point. And you make yourself scarce. But that's roughly all you got. You've become less brave, you become sometimes less smart over time as well. That's what you pay with. So, one of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to pay attention to all of the complexity around us. But this is sort of this context for what we're going to do. So, my talk is called Making Different Sounds. One of the things the reason we use the word different instead of new is that I think new is really it's really problematic. I don't think new necessarily brings a good delineating factor to things. What I want is different. Show me something I haven't seen. Tell me something I haven't heard. That doesn't have to be new, it just has to be different. So, we're also going to talk a little bit about this idea of hesitation. So, one of the things that I'm really interested in, we're so busy trying to get things done, to make things ready, to show the thing that we're doing. And one of the things that I'd like to advocate a little bit is those moments of not knowing, of not being quite sure yet, and not watching for that point where something tips over and you go, ooh, it was a mess, now it's a thing. What kind of thing is it? So these are the kind of things that are sort of underlying themes of what I'm going to show. So it's also worth just taking a moment to say we're living in strange times, to say it very mildly. These are weird, weird, weird times. And everybody's had, I mean, I'm sure there's people out there who has learned Italian and are in their fittest form ever, but I don't know any of them. Most of us are broken and scattered and a little worse off. And this is important to keep in mind, and also a little bit of the context of where we're at. So one of the things that has happened in my environment of students and colleagues is that the thing that has become, it was less of an issue before, but it has become more of an issue, is this notion of going in the moment of crisis. It becomes urgent that we start possibly considering that putting the human in the center of what we do is what led us here. Making everything nice for the human is how we got here. I'm not saying don't decide for the human. I'm saying it's possible that we can shift focus just ever so slightly to the side and have an ecology of different concerns influence the things we do. And those concerns could be politics or chemistry or the weather or a particular river or a particular ball of moss. This is a master student of mine called Lotte she's doing her master study on collaborating with moss. Now, I'm at a technical university. I think you'll probably understand that this initially was a little bit of a hard sell to a bunch of engineers. So one of the things that we're trying to do is to maintain this bubble inside the university where we can do these things that are not just a hard sell, but actually because we are in a well-delineated system of opposition, we actually get to be super precise about the hard sell we're about to do. So Lotte has been carrying this ball of moss around. And the irony, of course, is that the moss does not like being carried around. Moss really likes to stay. Doesn't like moving at all. Does not like the sun coming from a different angle than what it was before. It also kind of doesn't like sunshine so much. So she's been doing this project where she's trying to think about moss as a collaborating partner, but we're having this live conversation about the fact that she's kind of torturing this bowl of moss. I mean, like, she's making it very unhappy. She has to put it back in the fridge every once in a while so that it doesn't die. And I'm not saying that I have a good solution to this or that she will have a good solution to this come graduation, but I'm saying that these are the complexities that we're increasingly working with. And they go on all levels. And we are gonna have to stop thinking that we are providers of solutions and answers. Instead, we are increasingly staying within the difficulty. Stay in the thing that doesn't quite work. Keep listening to all of these different things, even if you don't have a good answer. So this is part of where we're at this moment. So just to give you a context. So increasingly, I am not doing a lot of work with music. I do design and work with instrument designers, primarily in the context of my PhD students. Overwhelmingly, when it comes to other students and other research work, we are broadening out. And by broadening out, it allows us to focus back in. So we are looking at things like digital craftsmanship. What does it mean to physically make with digital material as an actual material? This is something that's familiar to you guys. It's familiar from music. This is literally what you do. How do you craft with sound? And I'm bringing this to a much broader context, so I'm very happy to talk about this in the context of pasta shapes, if anybody feels like it. We're also talking about this idea of creative collaborations with machines. That's really yawn classic in music, but outside of music, it's not talked about so much. We think about machines. When it comes to fabrication and making, we treat our machines like our precious children. So we want the machine to do well. So we 3D print something, for example, or laser cut something, and then we spend 3 days sanding it. anybody then comes and says, oh, did you 3D print that? And you go, yes, didn't the machine do well? But you spent 3 days sanding it after because it didn't do well. It kind of did sort of crappily. And we treat our machines as these kind of beloved children. We really would like them to do a little better than what they're actually doing. And we end up essentially writing our children's essays. You know? And I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying it's interesting. And these are a collaborative effort as well. So I'm going to come back to this as well. The other thing I'm going to do throughout this is I'm going to try, when I remember to do it, to call out ideas. Where does an idea come from? I'm going to call out how is this published. I'm going to call out funding, and I'm going to call out credit. This is incredibly important and increasingly so. I strive to remember, don't always remember, to call out where things are coming from, particularly student work. But I'm also going to throughout leave references on the slides of things where I have written this down, i.e. you can go and find it and call me on it. So instead of doing kind of shock and awe presentations, trying to leave deeper traces, and I'm going to come back to this in the end. This is important. This is how we pay rent. This is how other people pay rent. Paying rent, I mean, it's not the only thing, but you know, it's nice sometimes. So I'm coming from the background of embodiment, really wanting to look about this idea of extended proprioceptive engagement, and thinking about how, when we think about complex things, our brains are not super good at that. Our brains are really good at going, oh, I need a snack. And why is there no more coffee? That's what our brains really want to do. But our bodies are really good at complexity. So for example, if we want to model the sea, and the waves, and the weather, of course, there are systems trying to do this, meteorological systems for starters, geography. But obviously this is hard and wrong, but our bodies know how to swim in the sea without even thinking about it. Not only can we swim in the sea, but we can kind of roughly do it without drowning. And we might even know where we're going. We might even be able to remember where we left our towel on the shore. And the way that I've found to deal with complexity is through engaging with it through our bodies, because our bodies are good at this. I mean, our bodies can dance. That's complicated. On uneven surfaces. I mean, like, you can't make anything do that. So this is part of where I'm coming from. I'm also trying to come to things from sort of what you might theoretically call misguided thinking. So I'm really, really interested in the things that we think work. You know, when the car doesn't work and we go, please, to the car. Or, you know, all of these things that we do, or we go, I feel weird, I think it was chilly last night, but it's just a fantasy. I mean, I don't know any of this. I mean, we make up these stories all the time, and they're deeply related to curses and spells and magical thinking. Magical thinking being this idea of misinterpreting cause and effect of things. And we do this all the time. And instead of thinking of something that needs to be rooted out through, you know, bright light and science, I'm thinking that we can make use of this as a way of storytelling and narrating the kind of work that we do. I'm also, as you will know, I like silly things. I like unacademic, dumb stuff. I caught myself singing a pop song earlier when we were doing this. And I think that there's a lot to be had in the silly and the ridiculous. Not that it shouldn't be serious, because one of the things I'd like to propose is that there is a wonderful place to work in, which is the ridiculous and deeply serious. It's an interesting place to be because it's challenging in all directions. We wrote a paper about this, so reference number 1. But also I want to just sort of like call back, like, performative aspects are really key to all of this for me, because of course the first rule of performance is you do one thing, anything really, then you do it with absolute conviction for much longer than could be reasonably expected. I mean, that's pretty much, you can do this with anything. Stacking chairs, going to work, just keep doing it for longer than anybody expected to. And you know, we're there. So that kind of means that my work can sort of be summed up in this idea of you sort of approach the world and its difficulty with attention and timing. And you perform actions deliberately with maximum applications. Whatever you do, do it with the everything. Leave it all on the floor. But then also this idea of opening and closing things like a book. This is all very, you can see where all of this is very, very rooted in performance and very, very rooted in music. But I'm going to talk to you about stuff where I'm bringing that thinking to other things. So the title of the talk was Making Different Sounds, so I'm going to like just unpack a little bit. Making, the actual physically making of stuff. We consider it it can be a form of inclusion. It allows a different way of thinking. And if we make, before we know what we're making, we are opening up our own thought process, not just to ourselves, but also to other people. And we're allowing people to participate, even if they might not necessarily understand like they haven't read the book that you're referencing. But also thinking about it as a way of asking questions, as a way of allowing things to be undone. So rather than making at the end and making beautiful things, which is very, very valid, I'm always trying to advocate the making in the process, making the thing you don't know what is, as a method of going, how will you find out the nature of that thing that is unknown to you? So, through this, obviously, we're looking at complex systems. And this is where I have in the last handful of years, together with a very interesting motley crew, there is a flow happening between musicianship towards textiles. And all of you can think of at least one. I can think of about 10. And this is interesting. There is a flow happening between experimental abstract music in various kinds and textiles. And part of the reasons of that is this collaborations with the machines, because textiles are really, really complicated. They're also live in nature, and they're entirely dependent on the musician or the maker in the center of it. So one of the things I've been looking a lot at in the previous years is weaving. Weaving being, of course, the original version of the computer, but also being a deeply, deeply embodied and complicated thing. A weaving pattern is like watching a written instruction for three-dimensional chess. It's a visual that is intensely difficult to wrap your head around. And it's not straightforward. And it allows all of these complexities, because in the weaving, not only do you have this quite complex instructions to the quite complex machine, but you also have the material itself, which we can program. We can add knowledge and material and behaviors to a non-electronic piece of thread. I will show some of that later. This is entirely possible. So we work enormously with thread that dissolve, thread that is made out of things that changed under certain consistencies. But one of the things that we're looking at a lot is this idea of over-twisting. You've all done this. When you over-twist a thread, it will tend to pull together. We're at this point now where we can go and we can find super fine silk thread that is over-twisted, and we can specify in what direction, and we can, on the same cone of thread, we can over-twist in different directions. This allows us to build things that move and have behaviors without any electronics, which is really, really interesting. And allows us down the path where we may consider a swirling ball of moss as a valid project for an industrial design master at a technical university. Complexity. So that means that this video is from a project we called Exquisite Fabrication. It was done during lockdown. I had somebody with an expertise in digital embroidery work together with somebody who's an expert in 3D printing. These are a PhD student and a master student working together, but they're both domain experts. There's no level difference. The finger that goes in and corrects. This is a point I'm interested in. This moment where you go, I set up the machine to do the thing that it's going to do, but then I'm also going to stand there and go, boop, when it does it right. So this guy has developed a silicone printer. This is really, really hard. Silicone is two-component. There's all these reasons why this is really hard to do. And what they ended up doing was making a complexity where they're making inflatables that are made out of digital embroidery, embroidered on dissolvable substrate, and then sandwiched into 3D printed silicone compounds. Super complex, we'll get there, but the interesting part of it was that they developed a series of markers that you can see here, and they're using them to take the same piece of fabrication from one machine to the other. So instead of trying to make the perfect machine, we're trying to make systems that allow us to calibrate from machine to machine, so that I can take the same tray of stuff from one machine to another, and I can say, what do you need to know in order to do this precisely? And overwhelmingly what it needs to know is where is 0 and how far is this? And then suddenly, and again, you will see how this translates back into thinking about music. So that means that we have to ask ourselves, how do we work with, and again, it's alongside these new machines. This is a spinning machine it's a reading machine, a factory called EE Labels. And what it does is it machine weaves labels, the kind of things you have in the back of your clothes, those scratchy things. So this is an interesting area because it's not fancy. But where most clothes production, and particularly rolled fabric production, has been is centralized in various Asian countries under awful situations, the label making is everywhere. These machines are everywhere. This is going to become important in a minute. So when the lockdown started, we phoned up the guys who have this particular loom, and we said, they were like, they had nothing to do. Everybody wanted to, quote unquote, save the world at that moment. So we started a project where we said, can we weave a mask? Because if you think of the labels in your back, in the back of your clothes, it's a super fine jacquard weave. So what we ended up doing, and this is the end thing that came out of this, is that this is a piece of fabric, and this is what it looks like when it comes out of the loom. This is not a 3D model, this is a photograph. So what we have is 5 layers of fabric coming out of the same system. So we have an outer, a spacer, an inner, a spacer, and an outer. And one of the things that is interesting, and where filtering is interesting and directly related to turbulence, the kind of turbulence you have inside of a music instrument, is that nobody really truly understands it. The reason this thing works is something called melt-blown polypropylene. This is why it's bad for the world. This is paper with melt-blown polypropylene. It's a plastic that you melt, spray it onto the paper, and it works because it is electrostatic. That's why you can't wash it. That's why nobody can make a washable face mask that works unless you put a paper into it that has been sprayed with melt-blown polypropylene. So that's also why it's really, really bad for the environment that we have all these things and they end up in the sea. So this filters, not on par with this thing, because this is a really high bar, but it filters on par with the surgical masks. But the interesting thing is that nobody really totally understands how that works. So we ended up doing this arty process for 2 years where we would weave things, test what we wove, and then kind of go, this is good flow, this is good filtering. Can we, from a designerly artistic process, think of what might be the pattern between it? And one of the things that we found was that we needed these patterns to be weirdly non-symmetrical. Like the more chaotic we made the patterns visually, the better they filter. We don't really know why. And this one works, it increases its ability the more you wash it, and we don't know why. We think it is a spin cycle. We think the spin cycle aligns the fibers inside the fabric, but we don't know. But we do know that it works. And that is, again, you can see how this is similar to how Nick Collins will say, if it doesn't smoke and it sounds good, don't worry if you don't understand it. And this is us taking that approach to a completely different concept. All right, different. So I'm going to show a tiny little bit of an older project called the Dinosaur Project. And I'm putting it in here because it's naughty and wrong, because it is a project that we proposed to the European Union. They gave us a bunch of money, thank you. And for this bunch of money, we were supposed to be doing intelligent agents for the making of dance music. Ooh, right? So all of this waiting for the drop stuff. And you couldn't have asked for a weirder group of people to possibly do this, as you can imagine, right? And so one of the things that was really, really interesting is that we did do those things. And we also found that our core user was a professional dance music producer. I mean, these were actually the people we were talking to. Sadly, I can't brag about who they were, but it was kind of impressive. And of course, you go to a musician and you say, Dan, I have this machine. Would you like it to make another piece of music that's going to sound more or less exactly like the one you just did? What are you going to say? No. And it ended up with us having to pivot in the middle. I mean, we knew this was going to happen, but other parts didn't know this. And we ended up being able to pivot the entire project in the middle of it towards this, I'd like it to do the opposite, actually. You know, how can we make these systems and these machines that we work with not necessarily fake help us in the sort of talking paperclip bad way, but how can we have these systems provide friction, obstruction, difficulty, and strangeness? How can we have the machines that we work with give us this kind of traction, this kind of texture back? And that became what the project became about. The funny thing is that it, of course, was wonderfully, this will work. It was done with the Redbull Music Academy, which sadly doesn't exist anymore. But, you know, that's the stuff.
The best things in Tokyo happen if you just throw yourself into it. And if you don't really make a plan, but if you just let Tokyo happen to you.
It is important not just to dance, to listen, to message.
Anyway, you had to, like, one of the things I learned during this project is that you can't cut the video before the drop, because people will be sad. So, so in this project, we ended up making algorithms that could convincingly and consistently detect the difference between house and hard house. You know, stuff like that, which is funny and amazing and utterly useless, but also funny, right? So this is where a lot of music development and music technology development is going into stuff like this. And some of this turns into a tiny little effect on one little dial on a native instrument, keyboard, that is actually in production. I mean, you wouldn't know, but there's a little, tiny, teeny, weeny little effect on an algorithm that drives a particular effect in a piece of native instrument keyboards that comes out of this. And that is a sort of thing that happens when you take a lot of this arty stuff that we do, and you bring it into a world that goes, huh, yeah, funny, cute. Oh, here's the thing, you can be part of talking about the texture of this little button. And that's how it is. So one of the ways that we got there was that we needed to talk to a bunch of musicians, we needed to talk to a bunch of people about what they wanted, but we didn't want to get caught up in the hard house versus house conversation because, you know, nobody has time. And also I'm not really solid on the distinction myself. So, you know, I didn't want to get caught out. And so what we did instead was we did these workshops where we asked people to say, you know, draw a picture of the sound you'd like to make. Of course, this is an impossible, ridiculous, absurd thing to ask anybody to do. I mean, nobody can do this, but also at the same time, yes, you can. I mean, you can't also not do this. I mean, you can't fail at it. I mean, it can't be wrong, but it also can't be right. But so that means that everybody can actually do it, which is, you know, a wonderfully absurd thing to have to do. And then we would bring really, really unreasonable materials. We will be doing a variation of this in a minute. And we will be saying, make the machine that makes that sound. And of course, this is an absurd thing. This was conducted in a bar, hence the many bar cups. So suddenly you're making instruments out of beer cups in a bar in Amsterdam. And here's a couple of examples of this particular workshop. This is a system that, if you imagine that there's a line going through the coffee cups horizontally, this is the time horizon. And the sound events in the software are coming up. And they're meeting the time horizon. And what she can do is that she can micro-adjust the time events as they come approaching towards her time horizon. The little squiggly bits of paper is the sound coming out. So this is a good example of something that is utterly absurd, but also, you know, we can all see the software happening, right? You know, like it's not so absurd that it isn't useful. This is a modular synth made out of beer cups that is all about, and one of the things that this guy wanted to do was to think about how you might layer these things and how they might work together, but it's just a series of beer cups that he could turn. And this, of course, is a wonderful, this actually is part of this thinking that turned into an actual instrument. So we can return to this later, but this is also a bunch of picnic plates. So one of the things that we're trying to do is to get down to talking about the thing that matters, or the thing that is easier to communicate about when you're looking at an idea that you're not quite done with having. So how can we make these things in such a way that we can talk about them before we know where it's going? So one of the things that we try to do is we try to make these things, and then I would bring stuff back to the Redbull Music Academy. This is Paris, and just sit with all these producers and go. It takes a little bit of guts to go up to a guy who's come straight out of the studio with Rihanna and go, I have a cardboard box to show you. So, there's an element of kind of, okay, going in, we can do this. But it's a really interesting conversation, and it works really, really well. It doesn't have to stay in the basements of beautiful art institutions. We can also do this in other places. All right, so this brings me to this quote that I love from Catherine Valenta. It's a children's book. And she says, first you build a machine, then it tells you what it's for. A machine is only a kind of magnet for attracting use. That's why we say things are useful, because they're full of the use that shows them that shows the machine to let them perform itself. So this is interesting. This idea of like we make things and then suddenly it turns out that the things that we make are good for something slightly different. And of course this is a children's book, so it's not a sort of a serious philosophical statement, but in another way it sort of is. She also talks a lot about how you have to launder your wishes. You have to take your wishes get old and moldy if you don't launder them and look at them, and if you're not careful they turn into regrets, and they're gnarly and sticky and unpleasant. And I'm a big fan of this woman's book, so I recommend, if anybody wants light reading, The Girl Who Circumvented Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making. This is where the stuff is from. Alright, I'm going to talk a little bit about sounds. I'm going to talk about Ty Sound's work. He's one of my PhD students. He works in Bergen. Some of you might know Thijs as Tapage, but he's basically worked for Stein for years, and what his entire PhD process is talking about the tipping points of chaos. And this is a really tricky thing to talk about because people have very, very different ideas of what they mean by chaos. So I made Thijs do a tiny little bit of video explaining himself so that I wouldn't mess it up. So let's see if this works. sent me an email saying, I made you some beeps and bumps. And that's what he did. So one of the things that he's interested in saying, can we make these instruments? And he keeps making these instruments. And can we make them so that they create circumstances that stay within his definition of chaos, but also have these sort of multi-stability of sort of crystallizing into these very particular things. In this case, it is very blibby and blobby and not at all like his actual music, but he was kind enough to do us a small video that's maybe like a little bit more explanatory in terms of what he does. So all of this is live, obviously, all of this is electronics, there's no computers anywhere near it, not in the traditional sense. And he's about a bit less than a year away from finishing his PhD in Bergen. So the other example I was going to show is Giacomo Lepri, who some of you know. And I met him at the, lockdown is weird. We met in Amsterdam and sat at a bench at the station and had a wonderful conversation earlier this week because everything was closed and we couldn't go inside anywhere. So like two hobos, we sat on the station and had a conversation before he had to go to Georgia Tech and present, I think, this instrument. And so Giacomo has just finished his PhD at Queen Mary with Andrew. Yes, thank you. My brain, it doesn't work. And he said maybe this one might be fun to talk about. This is I can't say this properly, the Ciondolo. And what it is, it's a set of magnets. Aesthetically, it's very interesting to see how this comes back. He did his master with us in the before times. And but again, you see these kind of quite playful interfaces towards, this is funny and serious at the same time in a sort of odd ways. And part of that energy that we're hoping to have in our engagements with the world. So I didn't bring a video of Dan Gibson's modified cello because I felt that this was like bringing bread to the baker's children, so I'm not going to talk a lot about modified cellos. I have done a bunch of them, but I figured you might already be talked out about modified string instruments. So I feel like I'm just going to show a tiny little aspect of this. Dan Gibson came to Stein and wanted to modify a cello. He couldn't afford to mess with an actual cello, so he had a MIDI cello that we messed with, because those things are not as expensive. And one of the things that we started doing was to use terrible materials to start prototyping what things might feel like. And the whole process was to move his entire super collider patch, like all of his controls, back onto the body of the cello. So the idea is what he didn't want to do was to do a little bit of playing and then a little bit of typing and then a little bit of, that thing. So he was trying to get out of that by having this live sampling situation, but what I wanted to bring to this was to think about clothes pegs and awful things and like packaging tape and cardboard as a way of, you'll see that there are actual functional interfaces taped onto the thing. He would hacksaw bits of this unfortunate cello and then glue it back on, and this thing was literally being taken apart on a weekly basis and then put back together and played. So again, we did the same thing that we did with the face masks. This is like, you take things apart, you test it, you work it, and then you build it back together again, and then it's through playing that you understand what you did. So he had this really wonderful process that we wrote up. can check the receipts on this. So I'm kind of putting in references everywhere we go and trying to talk about funding when there's funding involved, because I think it's really important for everybody to be really, really apparent and clear about where does the funding and the structures that allow these things coming from, because that's, particularly when you're starting out, can be really difficult and really difficult to see a way through. And shifting from one funding structure to another, either if you shift country or if you shift organization or whatever your background is a very, very odd thing. You have to learn entirely new languages. You have to think about where the values and the returns come from. Like publishing papers in mainstream conferences like CHI, Computer-Human Interaction, is incredibly valuable, not necessarily because these are your peers, but because it's like currency. So increasingly over the years, the people around me are not publishing at NIME so much. We're taking our NIME work to CHI. Like when we're doing work with children, we're taking our children's work away from computer interaction with children conferences towards CHI. So going for these mainstream conferences and trying to broaden the umbrella of what can be considered new and valuable and publishable inside of those environments can be the politically and the structurally correct thing to do, because it adds value to our work. So it's also worth sometimes taking things to the mainstream. Again, the Giant Steps Project was also an example of that. There's something really, really interesting about taking some of these thoughts to places that might not have heard them. They might not have known to turn up at all of the events we were doing. So advocating for that. So hesitation. So one of the things that we're trying to do all the way through this, not just because we want to, but because we feel that we're forced to, is this idea of embracing the things that don't work, embracing the things that are complicated. Let them stay complicated. Maybe it's not our job to resolve the tensions of the world or arrive at neat things. Maybe it is our job to make those tensions louder. Maybe it's a point of allowing things to happen that are uncontrollable, at least in part. So this is some of the sort of ethos we're trying to bring to things. And that means that sometimes you're just gonna have to sit with it. You're gonna have to sit with the thing that isn't right. And you're gonna have to think about how can this, to what extent is a thing that is problematic and difficult and challenging, to what extent is that core to the nature of your entire thing? We have a tendency to look at, say if we're making a prototyping process, we want to make a particular thing and eventually we manage. And then we look back at all the things we made, but we re-narrate it from the vantage point of the thing that we decided was the outcome. But all these other things happened along the way. And sometimes you end up with these loose ends and all these things that could have also been good outcomes. So one of the things that we're trying to think about is to embrace and celebrate the things that aren't working quite, but might be interesting in ways that might be challenging in themselves. So really trying to see if we can sit with that a little bit in our processes while still, getting stuff done. So that also opens up conversations about who are we, who are we, and who are in the audience. In music, often the audience is made out of musicians, more or less, and that's a wonderful, wonderful small club to be part of, a family even, and delightful, wonderful, but it also means that it's worth considering who's let in and who isn't let in, who's not coming through the door. We look around us and it would be easy to think of a couple of groups who might be underrepresented in a particular audience. And I think it's worth, at least, not in a kind of, we have to criticize everything just for the purpose of it, but it's interesting to think about whose voices are we listening to, and we might not be able to achieve fundamental structural change, but we might certainly be able to move things a little bit around the edges. And that might be that we have to start being more tolerant of the ridiculous, the not working, the not quite our style, the I'm not sure I like hard house. You know, I'm very much trying to keep in this moment where we say it's okay to do like the joke at Stein would always be. I bought on a secondhand flea market. I bought a lie detector, one of those things that gives you a slight electric shock if you have an emotional response on your skin. They're illegal. I bought this at a flea market. We had it lying around, and I remember one of Pete Edwards, the fabulous and incredible Pete Edwards, coming up to me one day, putting his hands on the lie detector and saying, "Polka is the very best music," and getting a really big electronic sap on his fingers. And I always thought it was such a wonderful kind of moment of going, you know, your mileage may vary here, you know, but it's interesting to have that kind of, to make that kind of super explicit. This is a drawing by an architect called Adolf van Eyck, and he was doing architecture, so he was the first of what we would call a humanist architect, so he was very much interested in he built children's orphanages from the vantage point of children. So if you're ever in Amsterdam, I would like to encourage you to go to this building, which is no longer an orphanage, and you get to sit around and you just sit down and kind of be the eye line of a 7-year-old, and then the architecture makes sense. And I always thought that was a charming, interesting things to do. But it's also important to keep in mind that Adolf van Eyck, where he started out, was in post-war Amsterdam, literally post-war Amsterdam. The starvation winter, where Holland starved, the winter after the liberation. And it was one big bombs. Everything was bombed, all this kind of, there was no food. And he got an internship as a very young person. And he got an internship with the city of Amsterdam. And he started building playgrounds in the middle of a hunger. And he built the playgrounds out of the materials they had lying around. So you know all of these classic things that everybody now thinks of as classic playground equipment? You know the metal tube that goes like this and the kids hang in their knees on them? You know these ones? That's Adolf van Eyck. You know the balancing points, lots of bits of wood doing this and you jump from one to the other? That's him. So there's still a couple of original Adolf van Eyck playgrounds left in Amsterdam. Very worth going to see them. They're made out of clearly scaffolding, tubing, and pieces of wood and self-made concrete. But very interesting is this idea of everything is broken, nothing works, there is so much to be done, people don't have houses, let's build playgrounds. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, rather think it's just thought for this time. Thresholds. I want to talk a little bit about some of the edge work that is happening also amongst my crew of students. This is a bunch of first-year master students. In the middle of lockdown, they came to me and they said, we're going to work together, we're going to make a spacesuit for Mars. Keeping in mind that the university was closed, they didn't even have access to a 3D printer, they had access to nothing. And they were going to build an actual spacesuit. Spacesuits are hard. But, so obviously they're coming to me with an absurd request like that, and I'm obviously, so my modus is that I warn them of the risks, and then I support them in doing it. I feel like I had to warn them of the risks first. So what they ended up doing was they ended up making a kind of leisure wear, like things to wear when you have to be brave. Because we started having conversations about this person on Mars. What does it take to be there? You have to be an adventurer of some kind. You have to be brave in a dangerous situation. You have to have this what does it take for you to be brave? And they came up with a set of things that they said, you want to be comfortable, you want to feel supported somehow. So they came up with all these soft qualities of what it might require to do something as stupid as going to Mars in an entirely hostile environment. And then of course because first-year master students are never-endingly brave, they decided to take an ecological, Mars-centric approach. So all of the garments were made out of glass fiber that can be made out of the sand on Mars, we think. And what was interesting was that they ended up writing a paper that got published, which is unusual for first-year master students. But the point that they ended up being was this idea of life on Mars, and they kind of came around to having done this through the pandemic and going, we were already on Mars. You know, we're already isolated and frightened and don't know how to be brave. And academically, they've done a brave thing. And we thought it was an interesting thing of looking at this threshold of when does this become the kind of work we do? I did not sign up to help students make spacesuits. It's not at all my jam, but I'm happy to support these things, and I'm happy to support these things as they emerge into whatever they need to be. Similarly, this is another one of my PhD students, Saul, who is working on, he's very, very interested in the human face. And he is very interested in these notions around identity. So part of his work is the paper that I referenced here, which is called The Potential of Apple Face ID as Drag, Queer, and Trans Technology. And what he's doing is he's making plastic facial prostheses and then training, using Apple ID as a way of validating what your face looks like now. And this is published at Kai. And so this is what I mean when we say we take work like this and we bring it to Kai for two reasons. We bring it to Kai because we want to mess with the edges of what we consider Kai. But we also do it because it works as a validation function, both internally and externally. The second Saul publishes this at the biggest technology conference in the world with the highest, with a really, really strict acceptance rate. It's very, very difficult to get Kai paper. It allows him to take the next step. And the next step right now for him is he just had this published, or rather accepted, not published yet, is that he's working with this idea of hair. So he's building, he's taught himself how to make a weave, like a hairpiece. And he's not using it to change, to accommodate a lack. You know, like typically with a weave, you would, you know, deal with a bald spot or something. And there's of course a lot of shame and weirdness around compliance with standard ideas of beauty, etc., etc. Hair pieces and weaves and wigs are a very contested and complicated environment. But what they're doing is they decided that it was unethical to work with other people's hair. So they're making people collect their own hair, and then they're sitting around painstakingly picking out the hair of people's hairbrushes, coloring and modifying that hair, making weaves that, for example, like this is a series of experiments of changing your widow's peak, you know, this one. So instead, you might have 5 of them, or maybe one of them is on your elbow. And again, is it music? No. Is it technology? Not really. But this is part of us trying to bring this complexity back into a kind of a mainstream where it becomes potentially something that might turn up when somebody Googles a paper in the ACM Digital Library. I mean, I kind of love that we're providing some of the oddnesses of those searches. So that's kind of part of the sort of joy in this. But these, again, threshold stuff. When I can't do any talk these days without talking about Joel Ryan. I promised I would put a youthful picture of Joel Ryan. He looks exactly the same and is my dear friend and collaborator. And this is a picture from a concert. You can sort of age the concert a little bit from the brand of the computer. And it's part of the number counters systems that he did right around the time when he was developing this idea of knowing when. So knowing when is deeply related to some of the things I'm talking about, which is this idea of you pause, you wait, and then you move. And so what I was going to do is I was going to talk about this little piece we did for Triple I. This wonderful art organization in Holland. And it's called 821 Words and 20 Images, because we were finding writing academic, theoretical complicated papers about these things a burden. I mean, literally. We were finding it difficult and it just wouldn't get done. So what we did instead was we played a game. We found a series of pictures, we sent them back and forth to each other, and then we wrote fig texts that weren't describing the pictures, but were describing the things we were thinking of when we looked at the pictures. And that's kind of how we got there. That's also why we decided to title this particular paper from its constituent parts. It's 20 pictures and a bunch of words in fig text. So here's some of those pictures. And this is kind of coming out of conversation. But one of these things that came out of this was this idea of the instrument as a vehicle for the desire to make music. And Joel says, it's both something that must be internalized, incorporated, and made flesh, and something other, without which we wouldn't be able to get to the sound from the world beyond. So Joel his original training is a theoretical physicist. He's he's a technical guy. He knows how to do this. He programs in various semi-dead programming languages. As some of you will know. And it's both physical, practical, actual, but also a vehicle for that desire to get to that thing that isn't here yet. So we find that an interesting place to look, but we also wanted to talk about the mindful imposition of the hand, because we fetishize machine precision. We would like our computers to be fast and precise. And like I said before, we are babysitting the things that come out of our fabrication machines. We are forever running around correcting the errors of machines and pretending we didn't do that. And we're tipping the scales, cleaning the corpus of our AI until it is so incredibly clean that it couldn't do anything but succeed. Forever, ever creating handrails for technology. And we fetishize this so much that we sometimes forget to make use of the mindful imprecision of the hand. This is a crackle synth that we have spent a lot of time re-engineering, and I would be delighted to talk about this a little bit later as well. If anybody feels like talking crackle synth with me. Crackle synth is interesting because it went through the same phase that you're in right now, where it was made once, beautifully, expensively, and then was made in a series, and loads of decisions had to be made in that complex. In our case, in the crackle synth case, the serial version of the crackle synth was technically better than the beautiful one. I own the beautiful one and one of the serial ones, and the production values are dramatically different, but the one that isn't so pretty sounds better. And then what we did was we made a third version. We tried to re-engineer it without getting rid of the parts that were important. So we fixed things like battery management, because we didn't feel that was necessary to have that bad. So that some things can be fixed and other things needed to be stay where they were. And then the other thing is this idea of, I'm sorry for cutting out the line, the performance. This is Studio 3. The performance becomes the test bed. This is where the unexpected curves into our plans. There's the performances are always slightly different than you think. Having been on the sort of organizing line of Stein concerts for 15 years, including setting up chairs and making sure somebody's handling sound, is that every single time, almost every single time, people come off stage and they say, "Did I play too long?" Because you don't know. And as an audience member, you sit there, particularly when you're listening to improvised electronic music, you sit there and you wait for this moment where they're going to collectively get off the bus. And there's this moment of you going, "Oh, this would have been a good ending. This would have been a good ending, but somebody continued. Damn, now we have to drive all the way through town again until we get back here," musically. We've all been there going, "It would have been so great if you stopped right there." But you can't. But when you're on stage, you can't do that. You can't tell. You don't know. Because you're seeing something else. Your brain is running at a different time. Your brain is running on a different clock, performance clock. All right, so we struggle to make instruments. We struggle to make interfaces. But the point of being a musician is that you pick up a thing and you say yes, because it is performative. So you can pick up most anything. I'm sure that any one of you, I could hand you like nothing, and you'd be able to say yes, whatever it is. We used to have I have a PowerPoint somewhere in my files, which is a PowerPoint we collected at Stein with people's permission, which was all of the concerts where people's technology failed. This happened a fair bit. And what's wonderful is, and one of the things that we wanted to make to make a point out of, is this idea of you're on stage, everything is clearly failing. Now what do? You don't go back and say, oh, you know, I'll restart. You play with whatever you have. And this is something that I think is, that is probably, to me, what constitutes musicianship in this field. But also what constitutes makership, what constitutes this idea of we are here, so now we deal, somehow. There's no going home and bringing your ball. All right, so where are the other places? Whitehead famously said that the traveler who's lost shouldn't ask himself, where am I? He should ask, where are the other places? So this is something that we have to consider as, where are the other places? This is a cloud chamber. Anybody here knows this construct? It's a black box filled of vaporized alcohol, and it was made initially to explore contrails and cloud formations in, I forget which university in America. Only that as a quirk, this particular department was right next to the department that explored radiation. So they kept having all this stuff happening. So this little thing sticking up, that's a radioactive isotope. And you can see those little contrails coming off it here and there. But that's not what's interesting about the video. What's interesting about the video is, and now of course it stops, is those big fat things that keeps happening. Those things, they're not coming from the little white thing. This is how people discovered background radiation. Those big fat things is background radiation. People didn't know what it was until it turned up as an error in their beautiful system that was made to look at this other thing. So that is interesting. So we can think of performances and we can think of our projects as us building beautiful little boxes that we built because we want to investigate this thing that we thought about. But then once we have it and once we pay attention, we have the opportunity and the chance that we might be seeing something else. There might be these big fat contrails coming from space that we didn't know existed. And metaphorically that might happen on all kinds of other levels. So, where are the other places? The other thing I wanted to sort of bring out is this idea of opposition, abstractions, and difference. We collaborate with each other, we collaborate with our machines, we collaborate with the material sort of realities of the world, but not everything has to be happy or have neat outcomes. It's okay for things to be against and in conflict and in friction. It's fine for this to happen. It's fine for these things to not necessarily work. And the thing that I wanted to say was about this idea of different outcomes. How am I doing the time? I have another minute? Yeah, good. Luddites. Have you guys heard of the concept of Luddites? Yeah. Luddites was a sort of a movement in early Victorian England, and famously against technology. What they actually were workers in weaving factories, spinning and weaving factories, seeing their work increasingly mechanized by the advent of steam machines and early computer systems, and being not too pleased about this. But so they moved into history as a sort of broad rejection of technology. But actually it's more complex than that. So the Luddites had two requirements for technology. There was definitely technology that they were happy with. And their two requirements for a good technology is, does it make better outcomes? Does it make better things? Can this machine make something I can't make? Is it finer, lighter, whatever? Does the technology make better work? Does it remove a heavy, unpleasant task from my work with? If the machine makes better work and better things, then it's fine. what they were seeing was machines making worse work and worse things. They weren't as pretty, they were full of errors that we needed to spend all this time fixing. And suddenly, who was a master weaver was now a child running around changing cones on a factory floor when that child should have been in school. So, in this paper, I wrote with a motley crew of designers and theorists, including the wonderful Alex McLean. We wanted to propose a third rule for what might be considering good technology. Does it make better things? Does it make better work? And one of the things that we wanted to say is, does it allow us to dream of different? Does it allow us to dream for different things? Not just the same, just, is there something that is off the technology, that is off the machine, that isn't just better or less laborsome for me, but is fundamentally different, that is a meeting with the other, that is a meeting with this, the lived reality of whatever that technology is. This is something that we're trying to look for in all the things that we do. And that means that we have to start thinking about the beginning and the end of new instruments. I'm going to do the quote because otherwise you're going to mentally just read it anyway. And Judith Butler says that, you know, we're required to risk ourselves precisely at the moment of unknowingness, when what forms us diverges from what lies before us, when our willingness to become undone in relation to others constitute our chance of becoming human. And I find it an interesting point to hold on to. It's quite an old text, and it's an interesting point to hold on to when we talk about this idea of more than human worlds, because it also allows us an opportunity to become human in a way that isn't just a de facto center of the world, but as something that might be more complicated, might be more varied, might be broader than what we thought it was. The beginning and the end of new instruments is something that came to me from a wonderful workshop I was doing in Edinburgh a handful of years ago, where somebody told me about this place in Norway where it's a museum for violins. And I don't have the reference for what the name of the museum is, but email me and I will tell you. Basically what they do is they are the museum for all of the traditional Norwegian violins. There's a huge violin culture in Norway. And of course what happens is that at some point a violin is a good example of an instrument like this. At some point it becomes too fragile to be played. I mean, at some point it just can't handle it. There's a lot of force happening internally in string instruments, as most of you probably know. And that means that obviously at some point wood gives out. You know, it's just, in order to restore it, you would have to break it. So one of the things that they do, which I thought was a very lovely thought, is that when an instrument is considered no longer playable, they organize one last concert. So they take this particular violin, they find the person that they think would be the best musician to play it, that they know of. They organize a concert, they invite an audience, they get this person to agree to come, they record the concert, and then after that concert, the violin is no longer an instrument, it's now a thing in their exhibition. It's an object in their exhibition, but it's no longer an instrument in the sense that it can no longer be played. So you could think of this last concert as a sort of a funeral for an instrument, as the instrument transitions from instrument to thing. And I always wanted to think about, can we think of the opposite? Will there be rituals for us to allow a thing to become instruments? And is this maybe a reversible process? Are we aware enough of these transition points where we say, this is the end of this version of my software, because now we will be doing something else. And this brings me to notions around archiving, which I want to loop back to in a minute. But we cannot be working in this field without thinking hard about archiving. And most of us, when I say archiving, will feel like going, I can't hear you, because it is difficult, unsolvable, problematic, but we either deal with it or we're sitting in the situation that I'm sitting in, where I am the caretaker of Michel Weishuser's legacy. This legacy constitutes of an enormous emotional and artistic influence, whatever, in the world. But with Stein gone, it means that I have the keys to a storage space, a safe storage space, with 16 cubic meters of work. Everything. Everything. Every single version of the hand, every computer required to run every version of the software. And now what? Now what? What do I do? Somebody stole this website of me. Like, I just had it blank. And I can't find, I mean, we could go after this person, but we can't find this person. Like the internet is a weird place. Like, it's, in fairness, I wasn't paying attention. I mean, you know, one can't be sitting around guarding the websites of people on a sort of daily basis. But archiving, finding a ways of honoring, but also finding a ways of saying, this is no longer an instrument, this is now something else. And the thing that I'm dealing with in a very lived reality is that there is a body of work in cardboard boxes, beautifully catalogued, but it's everything. Audio tapes, like storage materials on every conceivable format, including those little tapes that we used to have in answer phones. Good luck finding a machine that can read those. SIP drives, you know, big floppies, all that kind of stuff. Betamax, the lot. This is something that I'm not saying we have to solve this. I don't think it's necessarily solvable, etc. But it's something to consider for your own practices. This has to be part of what we do, and it has to be part of what we teach our students. All right, that brings me to this idea of noticing change. So this is the piece of fabric that I was going to show you guys. This is not a time lapse. What this is a piece of spun Japanese silk, and it has just come out of being dropped into a glass of boiling water. So you take this thread, you drop it into boiling water, it curls up. Not strange. This happens to lots of threads. This is us leaving the thread on the table, and as it dries, it uncurls itself. We don't know why. Nobody actually knows why. It unfolds itself as it dries. Something about the way the water enters the fiber loosens a structure that wants to be stiff. And then it does this. So, all the way down to something like this, you kind of go, the world is full of all these things that kind of work, and work weirdly, and work strangely, and there's bunches of stuff that we know. But there's also bunches of stuff that are truly magical and unknown, and I'm sure there's a molecular structural reasoning for this. It's just that I don't know it. And the people who sell the yarn also don't know it. And it's probably too small a thing to investigate for the world of molecular science, but I'm interested. You can buy this both in a set and a D version, which means that you can buy it turning the other way. What? We get to make, we're about to weave with this. So if we make the woven structures that we make light enough for that force to not be overwhelmed by the heaviness of the material, we're going to be having woven, digital, jacquard woven cloths that might fold. Maybe. I mean, we'll see. It's at least a thought, right? So this idea of like, one of my wonderful colleagues and PhD student, Bruna Gubaya de Arca, she wrote this wonderful paper called Becoming Travelers, and she was just saying, as makers, as designers, we have to be like travelers. That is, you're traveling in a new city and you're interested in everything. And you walk into the supermarket and you don't know what anything is, and maybe you're really trying to buy a bottle of water and you will have a challenge there, but half the time you'll be like, they eat that? Or have you seen this incredible graphics? And this idea of paying attention to anything that occurs, but also being willing to take detours and go down sidelines when something looks interesting. And if you don't have time to do it, at least go, we're coming back to this place later. Because I don't even know. Best laid plans, but also being open to the things that happen along the road.